The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the United Nations headquarters in New York. Delegates from 193 countries were gathering for what many considered the most important session of the year. The topic was the ongoing crisis in the Middle East, and tensions were already running high before anyone had even spoken. Captain Marcus Thompson adjusted his ceremonial uniform one final time as he stood outside the General Assembly Hall. At 45 years old, he had served in the British Royal Guard for over 2 decades, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't here as part of a diplomatic escort or ceremonial duty. He was here as a witness, carrying a message that would shake the very foundations of international diplomacy. Marcus had seen things during his military service that haunted his dreams. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless peacekeeping missions across Africa had shown him the true cost of war. But what he witnessed 6 months ago in Gaza had changed everything. The images were burned into his memory. Children running through rubble-filled streets, families separated by concrete barriers, and hospitals struggling to treat the wounded with limited supplies. The Royal Guard had been part of a humanitarian mission, officially tasked with protecting British diplomats during peace negotiations. What they found instead was a systematic operation that went far beyond what the media was reporting. Marcus had documented everything: photos, videos, testimonies from local residents, and most importantly, evidence of weapons shipments that violated international law. Inside the Assembly Hall, Prime Minister Netanyahu sat confidently with his delegation. He had addressed the UN many times before, always managing to deflect criticism and maintain support from key allies. His speech was prepared, his talking points memorized, and his diplomatic immunity assured. What he didn't know was that sitting in the observer section was a man who possessed information that could change everything. Marcus thought about his family back in London. His wife Sarah had begged him not to come forward. Their 2 children, Emma and James, were just starting university, and a scandal could destroy their father's career and their family's reputation. The Royal Guard had offered him early retirement with full benefits if he stayed quiet. The British government had made it clear that speaking out would be considered an act of insubordination. But Marcus couldn't sleep at night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of Amira, a 7-year-old Palestinian girl who had lost both her parents in an airstrike. She had looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, only confusion about why the world had abandoned her. That moment had shattered something inside him, something that all his military training couldn't repair. The session began with the usual diplomatic pleasantries. The Secretary General spoke about the need for peace and cooperation. Various ambassadors made carefully worded statements that said much but revealed little. Netanyahu took the podium with his characteristic confidence, beginning his prepared remarks about Israel's right to defend itself and the threats posed by terrorism. As Netanyahu spoke, Marcus felt his heart pounding. In his jacket pocket was a small recording device containing testimonies from Israeli soldiers who had witnessed war crimes. In his briefcase were photographs that major news outlets had refused to publish due to political pressure. And in his mind were the exact words he needed to say to cut through the diplomatic doublespeak and force the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Prime Minister was halfway through his speech when Marcus stood up. Protocol demanded that observers remain silent unless specifically invited to speak. Security guards immediately moved toward him, but Marcus raised his hand in a gesture that commanded attention rather than aggression. "Honorable delegates," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am Captain Marcus Thompson of Her Majesty's Royal Guard, and I have served my country with honor for 23 years. I am here today not as a representative of any government, but as a witness to what I have seen with my own eyes." A murmur rippled through the assembly. Netanyahu paused mid-sentence, his face showing the first signs of concern. The Secretary General looked confused about how to respond to this unprecedented interruption. Cameras that had been focused on Netanyahu suddenly swiveled to capture this unexpected moment. Marcus continued before anyone could stop him. 6 months ago, I was part of a humanitarian mission in Gaza. What I witnessed there goes beyond the statistics and reports you read in the news. I have evidence of systematic violations of international law, evidence that has been suppressed by powerful interests who benefit from the continuation of this conflict. Security was moving closer now, but something in Marcus's bearing made them hesitate. This wasn't a protester or a disturbed individual. This was a decorated military officer speaking with the calm precision of someone who had seen combat and understood the weight of his words. Netanyahu attempted to regain control of the situation. Mr. Secretary General, I must protest this disruption of official proceedings. This individual has no standing to address this assembly, and his accusations are clearly motivated by— Prime Minister, Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through Netanyahu's words like a blade. I have recordings of your own soldiers describing orders they were given that violate the Geneva Convention. I have photographs of weapons caches hidden in civilian areas by Israeli forces, designed to justify retaliatory strikes. And I have testimonies from Palestinian families who were used as human shields by the very army you claim operates with moral superiority. The assembly hall fell completely silent. Even the rustle of papers and whispered translations stopped. This was no longer a typical UN session filled with empty rhetoric and political posturing. This was a moment of truth that no one had expected. Marcus reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. These documents detail weapons shipments that bypassed UN monitoring, civilian casualties that were deliberately miscounted, and medical facilities that were targeted despite being clearly marked as hospitals. The international community has the right to know what is being done in the name of security and self-defense. Netanyahu's face had gone pale, but his diplomatic training kicked in. He began to formulate a response that would discredit Marcus while appearing reasonable to the international audience. What he didn't realize was that Marcus had anticipated this exact reaction and had prepared for it with evidence that would be impossible to deny or dismiss. The tension in the General Assembly Hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Delegates who had been checking their phones or whispering to assistants now sat frozen in their seats. The world's most powerful diplomats suddenly found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. A serving military officer from one of Israel's closest allies publicly challenging the narrative they had all carefully maintained. Netanyahu stepped closer to his microphone, his voice taking on the practiced tone of injured dignity that had served him well in countless press conferences. Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates, what we are witnessing here is a clear attempt to disrupt these proceedings with unsubstantiated accusations. This individual, whoever he claims to be, has no authority to make such statements, and I must question both his motives and his mental state. Marcus had expected this response. In his years of military service, he had learned to read people, especially those who wielded power. Netanyahu's reaction was textbook: attack the messenger's credibility before the message could take hold. But Marcus had prepared for exactly this moment. Prime Minister, Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. You mentioned questioning my mental state. Let me share something with this assembly about the mental state of the soldiers under your command. He opened his folder and withdrew a small digital device. This recording was made by Sergeant David Cohen of the Israeli Defense Forces, 3 days after Operation Iron Shield in Gaza City. Marcus pressed play, and suddenly the assembly hall filled with the voice of a young man speaking in accented English, clearly distraught. I can't sleep anymore. We were told the building was a Hamas command center, but when we went inside, all we found were families. There were children hiding in the basement. My commander said we had to make it look like they had weapons, so— This is fabricated, Netanyahu shouted, but his interruption only made the recording more damaging. The young soldier's voice continued, describing how weapons were planted in civilian homes to justify airstrikes, how casualty reports were falsified, and how medical personnel were prevented from reaching injured civilians. The Egyptian ambassador leaned forward in his seat, his expression intense. The representatives from Syria and Lebanon were frantically taking notes. Even traditionally neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden appeared deeply concerned. But it was the reaction of the American delegation that surprised everyone most. Instead of jumping to Israel's defense, they sat in uncomfortable silence. Marcus turned off the recording and looked directly at Netanyahu. Sergeant Cohen is not the only soldier who came forward. There are 17 others, all willing to testify under oath about what they witnessed. They reached out to me because they knew that speaking to their own chain of command would be pointless, and going to the media would be career suicide. The French ambassador raised her hand, and the Secretary General recognized her. Mr. Secretary General, if these allegations are true, we are looking at possible war crimes that demand immediate investigation. I move that this assembly call for an emergency session of the International Criminal Court. Netanyahu's delegation immediately began conferring in heated whispers. This was spiraling beyond anything they had prepared for. The Prime Minister had faced international criticism before, but never from someone with such credibility and such specific evidence. Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to the chaos his words were causing. The recordings are just the beginning. I have satellite images provided by Israeli military personnel that show the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. Water treatment plants, power stations, schools, all destroyed not because they posed a military threat, but because their destruction would increase pressure on the Palestinian population. He withdrew a series of photographs and held them up for the assembly to see. These images show Israeli military vehicles positioned next to UN refugee camps, using civilian shelters as cover for military operations. When return fire inevitably came, it struck the camps, allowing Israel to claim their forces were attacked while operating from protected civilian areas. The Iranian representative stood up. Mr. Secretary General, we have been saying for years that Israel operates outside international law. Now we have proof from one of their own allies' military officers. How long will the international community continue to ignore these crimes? But it was the response from an unexpected source that truly shifted the atmosphere in the room. The German ambassador, representing a country that had always been one of Israel's strongest supporters due to historical obligations, spoke with visible discomfort. Germany has always stood with Israel based on our historical responsibility. However, if these allegations are verified, we cannot in good conscience continue to provide military aid that may be used to commit war crimes. Netanyahu realized he was losing control of the narrative. His usual tactics of deflection and counter-accusation weren't working against someone who had come prepared with specific evidence and recordings. He decided to go on the attack more directly. Captain Thompson, Netanyahu said, emphasizing the rank with slight mockery. You claim to have served with honor, but what honor is there in betraying your allies? What honor is there in spreading propaganda that serves the interests of terrorists and extremists? I have to wonder what promises were made to you, what payments you received to turn against your own country's allies. The accusation of bribery or coercion was a serious one, and Marcus felt a flash of anger. But his military training had taught him to control his emotions under pressure. Instead of responding defensively, he used Netanyahu's attack to reveal even more damaging information. Prime Minister, since you've questioned my motivations, let me be completely transparent about how I came to possess this information. Marcus's voice took on a harder edge. I wasn't seeking this evidence, it found me. Israeli soldiers began approaching British personnel during our humanitarian mission because they had nowhere else to turn. They were witnessing atrocities and being ordered to participate in them. Marcus paused and looked around the assembly hall, making eye contact with delegates from different countries. These soldiers came to us because they knew we represented a nation that has historically stood for justice and human rights. They trusted us to do something with the information they were risking their lives to reveal. The British ambassador looked deeply uncomfortable. This was not the message his government wanted to send, but with the world watching, he couldn't openly condemn one of his own country's decorated military officers without appearing to condone war crimes. Marcus reached into his folder one more time. Prime Minister, you asked about my motivations. Let me show you exactly what motivated me to risk my career and my family's security to speak here today. Marcus withdrew a photograph from his folder, holding it up so the cameras could capture it clearly. The image showed a small girl, no more than 7 years old, sitting in what remained of a destroyed classroom. Books and school supplies were scattered around her, covered in dust and debris. Her eyes looked directly into the camera with an expression that somehow combined innocence and profound loss. "This is Amira Hassan," Marcus said, his voice softer now but carrying even more weight. She was attending school when an Israeli airstrike hit the building next door, a building that intelligence reports confirmed was being used as a weapons storage facility by Hamas. But here's what the official reports don't mention. Marcus paused, letting the image sink in before continuing. The Israeli military knew the school schedule. They knew children would be in session. They had surveillance showing families in the residential building that was also hit. Yet the strike was carried out during the day when civilian casualties would be maximized, not minimized. Netanyahu began to interrupt, but Marcus raised his hand. "Prime Minister, I'm not finished. The reason this strike was timed for maximum civilian impact was to create the very image you see here, a traumatized child surrounded by destruction. This image was supposed to be used in Israeli propaganda to show how Hamas puts children in danger." The revelation sent another wave of shock through the assembly. Delegates began speaking in hushed tones to their assistants. The implications were staggering, that civilian casualties were not just accepted as collateral damage, but actively sought for propaganda purposes. However, Marcus continued, something went wrong with the plan. Amira survived when she should have been killed. She became a witness instead of a victim. And what she told me through a translator was that Israeli soldiers had been in her neighborhood for 3 days before the strike, photographing buildings and asking residents about their daily schedules. Marcus looked directly at Netanyahu, whose face had grown increasingly pale. Amira's teacher, Mrs. Fatima al-Rashid, survived the attack but was severely injured. Before she died 2 days later, she gave me this testimony. Marcus activated another recording device. This time, the voice was that of an older woman, speaking in Arabic with an English translation being provided simultaneously. "The soldiers came to our school on Sunday. They asked many questions about our schedule, how many children we teach, what time classes begin and end. We thought they were planning to help us, to provide security. We had no idea they were planning to kill us." The emotional impact of hearing a dying woman's words was devastating. Several delegates wiped their eyes, and even seasoned diplomats who had heard countless tragic testimonies appeared visibly moved. The Swiss ambassador stood up. "Mr. Secretary General, I believe we need to suspend these proceedings immediately to allow for a full investigation of these allegations. If even half of what Captain Thompson is presenting is accurate, we are looking at systematic war crimes that require immediate international intervention." But Netanyahu wasn't finished fighting. He had survived political scandals, corruption charges, and international criticism before. His political instincts kicked in, and he decided to attack Marcus more personally. "Captain Thompson," Netanyahu said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone, "you present these recordings and testimonies as if they are unquestionable truth. But how do we know these aren't fabricated? How do we know you haven't been manipulated by sophisticated propaganda operations? The enemies of Israel are very skilled at creating false evidence." Marcus had anticipated this line of attack as well. "Prime Minister, I'm glad you raised the question of authenticity. Every recording I have presented has been verified by 3 independent audio analysis firms. Every photograph has been authenticated by digital forensics experts, and every witness has been interviewed by qualified intelligence personnel. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of documents. These verification reports were completed by firms in the United States, Germany, and Canada, all countries that are traditionally supportive of Israel. I wanted to ensure there could be no question about the authenticity of the evidence. The methodical way Marcus had prepared his case was becoming clear to everyone in the room. This wasn't an emotional outburst or a propaganda stunt. This was a carefully documented presentation of evidence that had been prepared with the thoroughness of a military intelligence operation. Marcus continued, "But, Prime Minister, you want to talk about sophisticated propaganda operations. Let me tell you about Operation Narrative Shield." The name seemed to hit Netanyahu like a physical blow. His confident demeanor cracked for the first time, and several members of his delegation looked genuinely frightened. Operation Narrative Shield is an Israeli military program designed to manage international perception of military operations in Gaza and the West Bank. It involves the deliberate creation of propaganda materials, the manipulation of casualty, statistics, and the strategic timing of military actions to minimize international criticism. Marcus turned to address the full assembly. "Delegates, you have all received intelligence briefings about Hamas propaganda efforts, and rightfully so. Hamas does engage in propaganda and does manipulate information. But what you haven't been told is that Israel operates an even more sophisticated propaganda network, one that has successfully influenced international media coverage and diplomatic reporting for over a decade. The accusation was explosive because it directly challenged the information that many countries had been using to justify their foreign policy positions. If the intelligence they were receiving was deliberately manipulated, then their decisions about military aid, diplomatic support, and UN votes had all been based on false premises. The Russian ambassador, who had been silent throughout the session, suddenly spoke up. "Captain Thompson, are you saying that the intelligence shared by Israel with NATO allies has been deliberately falsified?" Marcus nodded gravely. "In many cases, yes. I have documented examples of intelligence reports that were altered before being shared with allied nations. Casualty figures were reduced, evidence of civilian targeting was removed, and the capabilities of Palestinian militant groups were exaggerated to justify disproportionate responses." Netanyahu realized he was facing a complete collapse of Israel's international credibility. Desperate times called for desperate measures. He decided to play what he considered his strongest card, the historical sympathy that Israel had always been able to count on. "Mr. Secretary General, distinguished delegates," Netanyahu began, his voice taking on the tone of injured dignity that had served him well in the past. "What we are witnessing here is a modern version of the blood libel that has been used against the Jewish people for centuries. Captain Thompson's allegations, regardless of how sophisticated they appear, are fundamentally no different from the false accusations that have been used to justify persecution of Jews throughout history. But this time, the historical reference didn't have its usual effect. Too much specific verifiable evidence had been presented, and too many delegates were beginning to realize they had been deceived about the true nature of the conflict. The moment Netanyahu invoked historical persecution, a subtle but significant shift occurred in the assembly hall. Delegates who might have been swayed by this emotional appeal in the past now looked skeptical. The evidence Marcus had presented was too specific, too well documented, and too thoroughly verified to be dismissed as prejudice or propaganda. The Canadian ambassador was the first to respond to Netanyahu's historical reference. "Prime Minister, with all due respect, invoking historical persecution does not absolve anyone of accountability for current actions. The Jewish people's suffering throughout history makes allegations of current war crimes more serious, not less so, because we expect those who have experienced persecution to be especially committed to preventing it from happening to others." Marcus seized on this opening. Prime Minister Netanyahu, you mentioned the historical persecution of the Jewish people, and you're absolutely right that such persecution was horrific and unjustifiable. But I have to ask you this question directly. How does that history justify what I witnessed in Gaza? Marcus's voice became more intense, though he maintained his professional composure. I watched Israeli soldiers force Palestinian families from their homes at gunpoint, not because those homes posed any military threat, but because Israeli settlers wanted the land. I saw children as young as 5 years old detained and interrogated without their parents present. I witnessed medical supplies being deliberately blocked from reaching hospitals treating wounded civilians. He paused and looked directly at Netanyahu. Prime Minister, I've read about the Warsaw Ghetto. I've studied the systematic dehumanization of Jewish communities in Europe, and what I saw in Gaza had disturbing similarities to those historical injustices. The irony is heartbreaking. The comparison was devastating precisely because it came from someone who clearly had deep respect for the historical suffering of the Jewish people. Netanyahu's face showed genuine anger for the first time, but also something else. Recognition that his usual defensive strategies weren't working. Marcus continued his testimony, his voice steady but filled with moral conviction. Operation. Narrative Shield has 3 main components. First, the systematic manipulation of casualty statistics to minimize reports of civilian deaths. Second, the strategic use of human shields, not by Hamas, but by Israeli forces positioning military assets in civilian areas to justify retaliatory strikes. Third, the deliberate provocation of violent responses from Palestinian groups to create justification for disproportionate military action. The Brazilian ambassador raised his hand. Captain Thompson, these are extremely serious accusations. Do you have documentation of these specific operations? Marcus nodded and withdrew. Another set of documents. I have operational planning documents, communication intercepts, and photographic evidence of all 3 tactics. But more importantly, I have testimony from Israeli military personnel who participated in these operations and are now willing to testify publicly about what they were ordered to do. He activated another recording device. This time, the voice belonged to a different Israeli soldier, speaking Hebrew with English subtitles appearing on screens throughout the assembly hall. My name is Lieutenant Sarah Goldberg, and I served in the intelligence corps of the Israeli Defense Forces. I can no longer remain silent about what I was ordered to do during Operation Protective Edge. The recording continued with Lieutenant Goldberg describing how intelligence reports were systematically altered before being shared with international allies. Civilian casualties were reclassified as combatants, evidence of war crimes was removed from official reports, and false information about Palestinian military capabilities was inserted to justify Israel's actions. Netanyahu attempted to regain control of the situation. Mr. Secretary General, these recordings could easily be fabricated. Voice recognition technology makes it simple to create false testimonies that sound authentic. We cannot base international policy on unverified claims from unknown sources. But Marcus was prepared for this objection, too. Prime Minister, I anticipated you would question the authenticity of these testimonies. That's why I arranged for independent verification. He gestured toward the gallery where several people were sitting in the observer section. Lieutenant Sarah Goldberg is here today in this assembly hall. She has requested permission to address this body directly. She is willing to submit to any authentication procedures the Assembly deems necessary, including voice analysis, polygraph, testing, and cross-examination by qualified intelligence experts from any nation represented here. A murmur of surprise rippled through the Assembly. This was unprecedented. Active military personnel from one country offering to testify against their own government in an international forum. The implications for international law and diplomatic protocol were enormous. The Secretary General looked genuinely confused about how to handle this situation. There was no precedent for such testimony, and the legal implications were unclear. but the political implications were crystal clear. Refusing to hear the testimony would appear to be a cover-up, while allowing it would legitimize the accusations against Israel. Netanyahu realized he was trapped. If the assembly allowed this testimony, it would be devastating to Israel's international standing. If they refused to hear it, it would appear that they were complicit in covering up war crimes. He decided to make one final desperate attempt to discredit the entire proceeding. "Mr. Secretary General," Netanyahu said, his voice rising. "What we are witnessing here is a carefully orchestrated attack on the state of Israel. Captain Thompson may believe he is acting independently, but he is clearly being manipulated by forces that seek to destroy the only democratic nation in the Middle East." He pointed directly at Marcus. "This man has been used as a pawn in a sophisticated disinformation campaign. His military service record, his apparent sincerity, his detailed preparation, all of this makes him the perfect vehicle for spreading lies that appear credible." But Netanyahu's attack backfired spectacularly. The Poi, Japanese ambassador, stood up with obvious displeasure. "Prime Minister Netanyahu, are you seriously suggesting that a decorated officer of the British Royal Guard is either stupid enough to be manipulated or corrupt enough to be bought? That is not only insulting to Captain Thompson, but to our ally, the United Kingdom, and to this entire assembly." The British ambassador, who had been trying to remain neutral throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. "Prime Minister Netanyahu, while Captain Thompson is speaking here without authorization, from Her Majesty's government, I must strongly object to any suggestion that Britain's military officers can be easily corrupted or manipulated. Captain Thompson's service record is exemplary, and his integrity is beyond question." Marcus had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward again. "Prime Minister Netanyahu, you've questioned my motives, my evidence, and my credibility. You've suggested I'm being manipulated or corrupted, but you haven't addressed the substance of a single accusation I've made." He held up the original photograph of Amira again. "This little girl is not a fabrication. She is not a manipulation. She is a real human being whose life has been destroyed by policies you implemented, and she is one of thousands of similar victims whose stories have been suppressed by the propaganda operation you oversee." Marcus's voice became harder, more direct. "Prime Minister, I'm going to give you one opportunity to respond honestly to this assembly and to the world. The evidence I've presented today will be made public regardless of what happens in this room. The recordings will be released to international media. The documents will be submitted to the International Criminal Court. The witnesses will testify, publicly with or without this assembly's permission." The ultimatum was clear, and everyone in the room understood its implications. Marcus was not just presenting evidence. He was forcing Netanyahu to make a choice between continuing to deny obvious truths or acknowledging policies that could result in war crimes prosecutions. The silence that followed Marcus's ultimatum was deafening. Every delegate in the assembly hall understood that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in international relations. The comfortable world of diplomatic doublespeak and carefully managed narratives was crumbling before their eyes. Netanyahu stood at his podium, his usual confidence completely shattered. For decades, he had navigated international criticism through a combination of historical sympathy, strategic alliances, and carefully managed information. But Marcus had systematically dismantled every one of his defensive strategies with evidence that was too specific and too well documented to ignore. The Prime Minister's advisors were frantically whispering in his ear, but their suggestions were useless. This wasn't a political crisis that could be managed with spin and counter-narratives. This was a reckoning with documented truth that demanded either acknowledgement or denial, with no middle ground. Marcus stood calmly, his military bearing unchanged despite the enormous pressure of the moment. He had risked everything to reach this point: his career, his family's security, his personal reputation. But he also knew that this moment represented the culmination of months of careful preparation and moral certainty. "Prime Minister," Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the whispered conversations, "I want to be completely clear about what I'm offering you. This is not a trap or a manipulation. This is an opportunity for honesty that may never come again." He gestured toward the assembly. "Everyone in this room knows that the current situation in Gaza and the West Bank is unsustainable. Everyone knows that the civilian casualties are real, regardless of how they're reported. Everyone knows that the cycle of violence will continue, unless someone has the courage to break it with truth." Marcus paused and looked directly at Netanyahu. "You have the power to end this today. You can acknowledge what has happened, commit to ending the policies that caused it, and work with the international community to create a just solution. Or you can continue to deny obvious realities until the evidence I've presented forces the international community to act without Israel's cooperation." The offer was stunning in its directness. Marcus was essentially offering Netanyahu a path to avoid complete international isolation and possible war crimes prosecution in exchange for honest acknowledgement of Israel's actions. The French ambassador leaned forward in her seat. The German representative appeared deep in thought. Even the American delegation, which had remained conspicuously silent throughout the proceedings, seemed to be reconsidering their traditional support for Israel. Netanyahu looked around the assembly hall, trying to gauge the mood of different delegations. What he saw was deeply troubling. Countries that had always supported Israel were now looking skeptical or uncomfortable. Nations that had been neutral were showing clear signs of turning against Israeli policy. Even Israel's closest allies seemed unwilling to defend the indefensible. The Prime Minister made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Captain Thompson, you speak of truth and justice, but you ignore the fundamental reality of Israel's situation. We are a small nation surrounded by enemies who seek our destruction. Every action we take is motivated by the need to protect innocent Israeli civilians from terrorist attacks." But Marcus had anticipated this response as well. "Prime Minister, let me address that argument directly." He withdrew yet another document from his seemingly inexhaustible collection of evidence. "This is an internal Israeli military assessment of the actual threat posed by Palestinian militant groups as of 6 months ago." Marcus read from the document. Quote, "Current Palestinian militant capabilities pose minimal strategic threat to Israeli territory. Rocket attacks, while politically significant, cause negligible casualties and minimal infrastructure damage. The primary security challenge is managing international perception of Israeli military responses to these limited threats." End quote. The revelation was devastating because it came from Israel's own military analysis. The document essentially acknowledged that Palestinian attacks were not a significant security threat, but rather a political problem that required management of international opinion. Marcus continued reading. "This same assessment recommends, quote, maintaining a perception of existential threat is crucial for maintaining international support and justifying necessary security measures in occupied territories. In other words, Prime Minister, your own military knows that the threats you describe are largely exaggerated for political purposes." Netanyahu's face had gone completely pale. The document Marcus was reading from was classified at the highest levels of Israeli intelligence. Its very existence in Marcus's possession suggested that the opposition to current policies reached into the highest levels of Israel's security establishment. The Norwegian ambassador stood up. "Mr. Secretary General, I believe we have heard enough evidence to justify immediate action. I move that this assembly call for an emergency session of the International Criminal Court, a comprehensive investigation by the UN Human Rights Council, and the immediate suspension of all military aid to Israel pending the outcome of these investigations." Several other delegates immediately voiced their support for the motion. The momentum in the room had shifted decisively against Israel, and Netanyahu could see his country's international isolation becoming inevitable, but Marcus wasn't finished. He had saved his most powerful revelation for last, knowing that everything else had been building to this moment. Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's one more thing you need to know. The evidence I've presented today represents only a small fraction of what Israeli military personnel have documented. Marcus gestured again toward the observer gallery. There are currently 43 Israeli soldiers, officers, and intelligence personnel who have come forward with evidence of war crimes, systematic human rights violations, and deliberate deception of international allies. They are prepared to testify publicly with full documentation about operations spanning the last 5 years. The number was staggering. 43 military personnel represented a significant portion of those directly involved in operations in Gaza and the West Bank. Their willingness to come forward suggested that opposition to current policies was widespread within Israel's own security establishment. Marcus continued, "These individuals are not traitors or foreign agents, Prime Minister. They are patriots who love their country and want to save it from a path that leads to international isolation and moral bankruptcy. They have risked their careers and their freedom to provide evidence because they believe Israel can be better than this." For the first time since the proceedings began, Netanyahu appeared genuinely shaken rather than just politically concerned. The revelation that dozens of his own military personnel were prepared to testify against him suggested that his political survival and possibly his personal freedom were in immediate jeopardy. Marcus made his final appeal directly to Netanyahu, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral conviction. "Prime Minister, I'm going to ask you one last time. Will you acknowledge what has happened and work with the international community to create justice for the victims, or will you force the world to act without you?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Everyone in the assembly hall understood that Netanyahu's next words would determine not just his own fate, but the future of Israel's place in the international community. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Netanyahu stood frozen at his podium. Every eye in the General Assembly was focused on him, waiting for a response that would either acknowledge decades of documented atrocities or deny evidence. That was already spreading across international media networks in real time. Marcus had achieved something that decades of diplomatic pressure, UN resolutions, and international criticism had failed to accomplish. He had created a moment where denial was no longer possible, where the comfortable fiction of plausible deniability had been stripped away by irrefutable evidence presented by an unimpeachable source. The Prime Minister's advisors had stopped whispering. They understood, perhaps better than Netanyahu himself, that there were no good options remaining. Any response would either be an admission of guilt or an obvious lie that would be exposed within hours by the evidence Marcus had promised to release publicly. Finally, Netanyahu spoke, his voice barely above a whisper but clearly audible in the dead silence of the assembly hall. "Captain Thompson, you have presented serious allegations that require careful consideration." His usual commanding presence had completely evaporated, replaced by the demeanor of a man who understood that his political career and possibly his freedom hung in the balance. Marcus remained silent, allowing Netanyahu's words to hang in the air. The Prime Minister was clearly stalling, trying to find a way out of an impossible situation. But the 43 Israeli military personnel sitting in the observer gallery, the recordings that had already been played, and the documents that had been photographed by international media made retreat impossible. However, Netanyahu continued, trying to regain some semblance of authority, these matters involve national security information that cannot be discussed in an open forum. I would be willing to address these concerns through appropriate diplomatic channels with proper security protocols in place. It was a classic political maneuver, acknowledge the seriousness of the allegations while refusing to actually address them publicly. But Marcus had anticipated this response and was ready with a devastating counter. "Prime Minister," Marcus said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment, "the time for private diplomatic discussions has passed. The victims of these policies don't have the luxury of waiting for convenient diplomatic timing. The families who have lost children don't have the patience for security protocols that exist primarily to protect those responsible for their suffering. Marcus gestured toward the gallery where Lieutenant Sarah Goldberg and other Israeli military personnel were sitting. The men and women who served under your command and witnessed these atrocities have already chosen transparency over security. Classifications. They understand that some truths are too important to remain classified. The British ambassador, clearly uncomfortable with the unprecedented situation, finally spoke. Mr. Secretary General, while the United Kingdom government did not authorize Captain Thompson's testimony here today, we cannot ignore the serious nature of his allegations. Britain calls for an immediate and comprehensive investigation by the International Criminal Court. This statement from one of Israel's closest allies sent shockwaves through the assembly. If Britain was abandoning its traditional support for Israel, other nations would quickly follow suit. The diplomatic isolation that Netanyahu had spent decades trying to prevent was becoming inevitable. The American Secretary of State, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. Her words were measured, but their implications were enormous. The United States has always supported Israel's right to defend itself. However, if these allegations are substantiated, we would be forced to reconsider all aspects of our bilateral relationship, including military aid and diplomatic support. It was a diplomatic earthquake. American support had been the foundation of Israel's international standing for generations. Without it, Israel would face complete isolation and possible economic collapse. Marcus sensed that the moment had come for his final, most powerful revelation. He had saved it for this exact moment, when Netanyahu was most vulnerable and the international community was most receptive to dramatic action. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Marcus said, his voice now carrying the authority of moral certainty, there is one more thing you need to know before you decide how to respond. The evidence I have presented today has already been shared with the families of every victim mentioned in these documents. Marcus paused to let this information sink in. Amira Hassan, the 7-year-old girl whose photograph I showed you, is now 8 years old. She has been living in a refugee camp in Jordan for the past year. Tomorrow morning, she will be boarding a plane to New York, where she will address this assembly directly about what she witnessed. The revelation was stunning. Marcus had not only documented the atrocities, he had brought the victims to speak for themselves. The political and emotional impact of an 8-year-old Palestinian girl telling her story to the UN General Assembly would be unprecedented. Furthermore, Marcus continued, 17 families of Palestinian victims will be arriving throughout the week to provide testimony. They will be accompanied by the Israeli soldiers who witnessed the events that destroyed their lives. The world will hear both the victims and the perpetrators telling the same story. Netanyahu's remaining composure finally cracked completely. The careful political calculation that had sustained his career was useless against the moral force of victims speaking directly to the international community. No amount of diplomatic maneuvering could counter the testimony of a child describing the murder of her parents. Prime Minister, Marcus said, his voice now gentle but implacable, this is your last opportunity to choose between justice and denial. You can acknowledge what has happened and work to make amends, or you can force these victims to relive their trauma in public while the world watches you deny their experiences. The choice Marcus presented was not just political, it was moral. Netanyahu could either accept responsibility and possibly salvage some measure of redemption, or he could continue his denials and face complete moral and political destruction. The Assembly Hall remained in absolute silence as Netanyahu struggled with the decision that would define the rest of his life and determine the future of his country. The comfortable world of managed narratives and diplomatic immunity had been shattered by a royal guard who had chosen conscience over career, truth over loyalty, and justice over political convenience. Marcus stood calmly, his duty completed. He had risked everything to reach this moment. And regardless of what happened next, he had succeeded in forcing the truth into the light. The world would never again be able to claim ignorance about what had been done in the name of security and self-defense. In the observer gallery, 8-year-old Amira Hassan's flight was already preparing for takeoff in Jordan. By tomorrow, her voice would echo through this same assembly hall, and no amount of political maneuvering would be able to silence what she had to say.